Good day to one and all, and welcome. Today we're going to be discussing Kabbalah and Sex Magic, a mythical ritual genealogy, which is the brand new book recently released by Dr. Marla Segol. Dr. Segol is an associate professor in the Department of Global Gender and Sexuality Studies at the University of Buffalo, the current president of the Societas Magica, and also a longtime personal friend of mine. The book is being released by Penn State University Press, which is the same press that published our edition of the Picatrix. And today I'm looking forward to exploring some of its ins and outs, so to speak. Marla, thanks for coming on the show.
Dan, thank you so much for having me. I'm really delighted to be here, and I'm absolutely honored and pleased to be sharing this experience with you.
And likewise. So before jumping into some of the more nitty-gritty details, could you perhaps give us a broad overview of what your new book is all about? And could you perhaps give us your working definition of sex magic? How narrow is it? How wide is the term? Are we talking about magically compelling desire through the building of talismans? Are we talking about increasing fertility using magic squares? Are we talking about the retention of sexual energies until they blow out your third eye? Or is it a bit of all of the above?
It's so few of those things. It's amazing few of those things. I have a really, really narrow definition of sex magic. My definition is that it is using sexuality to participate in the divine creation process and to access divine power for good in the world. So it does not cover all the varieties of sex magic. It just covers this one form of it, this one manifestation of it. And so the idea behind this book, well, first of all, the idea behind this book was never to write this book. It was to write a different book. And this is the one that came out. But that original book was meant to, it was called something very boring, like Kabbalah's Two Bodies. And it was meant to talk about the relationship between the human body and the divine body in the tradition of Jewish Kabbalah. Right. And from the earliest Jewish esoteric texts until the tradition became fully formed, and then to look at its contemporary practice. But when I started doing the research for that book, I was very surprised at what I found. Because what I found is that not only do human and divine bodies interact, and not only does God have a body, but God has a bigendered body that interacts with itself in some very surprising ways. I'm like, oh, wait a second. This text, this Shir Koma, actually depicts God as having two genders and having sex with God's self. And there are human participants who are watching. And not only that, it's part of the prayer service. And I was like, okay, this has got to be a different book. This is something very different. So it started with that. And then I started to understand that so that there are all these sections in the Zohar where they actually talk about human desire and how it's supposed to be directed, and how if you have sex the right way, you will bring down blessings into the world. And you will also do that by reuniting, the lowest feminine aspect of the divine, the Shekhinah, with her husband Tiferet, who is the fifth aspect of the divine. And when you do that, they have sex and blessings come down. I'm like, oh, all right, this is a different book. This is about God having sex with God's self and human beings emulating that and using it to access power.
So a big part of my personal research focuses on the reception of Platonic philosophy into Christianity, and especially this idea shared by Platonists, Christians, Muslims, and some Jews like Saadia Gaon or the Rambam Moses Maimonides, that God is wholly immaterial, and that it's an error to conceive of him as anything other than immaterial spirit. Could you touch on how such widely divergent attitudes develop in regard to the corporeality of God during late antiquity and the early Middle Ages, especially through the Shir Koma?
Oh, that's a great question. Well, I mean, I think you read the introduction, and I'm not sure if I put it there, but Maimonides at first was fascinated with the Shir Kama, and Saadia Gaon also wrote about the Shir Kama. Saadia wrote that it was probably not genuine, right? Meaning that there's rabbinic speakers in there like Rabbi Ishmael, and he said they probably never said that, right? So the Shir Kama is written in this almost like a Jewish commentarial tradition, and it's meant in some ways to emulate the kinds of materials that appear in the Talmud. And Saadia was saying, oh no, they never said that. They never wrote that, right? And Maimonides also really engaged the Shir Kama. And at first he was very interested in interpreting it. And then he dismissed it as foolishness and nonsense, right? So what that shows me is that there are always at least two different understandings about the divine nature. And these two understandings are consistent with the behaviors of religions worldwide, right? And I'm not saying that every single religion does that, because that would be silly. But most religions have like dual concepts of what divinity is and how divinity acts. And so most religions have a concept of a like radically transcendent divine, like the one you were just talking about, like Saadia and Maimonides, like they describe, right? At the same time, they also have a concept of an immanent divine, a God in your body. Like it says in the Quran that God is as high as the heavens and as close as your jugular vein, right? So there's this idea that almost any tradition has these two coexisting conceptions of the divine, and depending on where you are culturally and historically, one of those is going to come to the fore while the other will not entirely disappear. Does that start an answer? It doesn't give you the historical context, which I can do if you'd like.
This is the same answer that I feature in my own dissertation, is this tension at work between the immanent and the transcendent, and that is the chief question about late antiquity and late antique philosophy is, how do we reconcile these differences? And there are all kinds of methods that come about, whether they be magic or mysticism or metaphysics or whatnot. But I think it really was the zeitgeist at the time that we see in from Plotinus onward to Proclus and all of the people reading those materials. That seems to be really what they're interested in, is bridging this paradox.
Right. I think some traditions try to bridge it. And I also think some others just inhabit it, right? And they often inhabit it by storytelling, and they often understand it through juxtaposition. So what they'll do is they'll tell two different stories that exemplify the conflict. But I think the point of telling those stories is not to bridge it necessarily or to resolve it, but just to talk about it. Like just to say, okay, there's this and there's that, and here they are together. And what do we make of it? Right. So it's to interpret it or to inhabit it, or even to kind of revel in it. Right. So I think stories can do that as well. And I think that's often the case in the kabbalistic materials. Right.
Why do you think that there's so much reliance on storytelling instead of abstruse metaphysics or that sort of thing?
I think it's the genre, right? Because you begin with the Hebrew Bible, and that's stories, right? And then people start noticing that there are multiple versions of one event, or that there are gaps in the text, or that, the other thing that's really important, and I think this is important about the development of Christianity too, is that these early texts, like these very early texts, like 12th century BCE, all the way up to maybe about the 7th or 6th century BC, they don't talk about feelings and they don't talk about motivations, right? Mm-hmm. And what's happening all around, the Hebrew, like what's happening all around the emergent Jewish community and what's happening around the people who generated this tradition is that you've got philosophy happening and you've got a much greater attention to individuality and you've got a much greater attention to interiority. And this is a thing that changes with the times, right? And so I think as the canon is getting edited, right? So the canon of the Hebrew Bible has a major period of editing between the 5th and the 4th centuries. You've got people that are editing it, but they're also thinking about these questions and they're not putting them into the canon. But what they're doing is they're writing stories that address these questions of emotions, motivations, interiority. And so you've got stories that are sort of filling in the gaps of stories. And so that evolved as a major interpretive methodology. But the great part about it, of course, is that, like as Levi-Strauss said, myths always generate more myths. Mm-hmm. Yeah, and so I guess that's the other aspect of this, is that this is mythology. It isn't philosophy, but there is such a thing as Jewish philosophy. Like Saadia does Jewish philosophy, Maimonides does Jewish philosophy. But one of the things that you notice if you read either one of those is that they use a lot of stories to make their points, even though they argue. Like they use narrative to make their points, right? So and they're doing it because they are intervening in a body of mythology. What do you think?
Yeah, that makes perfect sense. I think probably it bears mentioning that in late antiquity and onward is when we start to see a development of different methods of interpretation. So Jews have the pardes and Christians have the fourfold method, which they're very similar. We have the literal reading.
They're quite different, though.
Yes. And they are actually quite different, even within each tradition. I've noticed that there's lots of diversity in how people interpret these 4 methods. So you have the literal, you have the allegorical, and then you have the tropological, which is like the moral dimension of a text, and then the mystical or the spiritual. And sometimes they'll interpret it as, you have the literal reading and then you have the allegorical reading, and that one branches out into 3, which is the allegory proper, and then moral allegory, and then mystical allegory. And then you have others who look at each one completely differently. And this is really the method that develops throughout the Middle Ages for bridging this gap between the transcendent and the immanent, or at least just inhabiting it, as you say. And that is by saying that every given text can be interpreted in a great number of ways. It's like you said, myth proliferates myth. And there are different kinds of myths. There is the surface where you talk about historical events. And then there are the deeper ramifications of, what is the sign writing that God is doing right now in these texts? What are the messages, the deeper messages that are meant to be contemplated? I don't know if you wanted to touch on this.
Oh, on the method?
Oh, on this, proliferation of senses of scripture and how we read things in different ways.
Yeah. Between the traditions or just in general?
In general, between the traditions is fine, but we can focus on Judaism here.
Well, right. I mean, one of the interesting things about Judaism, like in terms of studying it, is that it truly is a cumulative tradition, right? Mm-hmm. And within rabbinic Judaism, there is an idea that every generation is bound to interpret the Torah, right? And that the Torah is in a process of ongoing revelation. So what that means is that, like, the turn it and turn it for everything is in it, right? Mm-hmm. So the idea is that you can't exhaust it in terms of meaning, and that every generation is bound to find their own. So what that means is that so long as they are securely grounded in the textual tradition, it's an open text. Mm-hmm. And so that's how you get the development of mystical traditions like the Kabbalah. I mean, they are, at their very base, they are interpretive movements, right? So one of the things that this book is about is, again, by accident in studying the development of sex magic, I also wound up studying the development of the kabbalistic cosmology, because I learned some really interesting things, right? That you can identify key texts that get interpreted over and over and over, right? And you can almost see a paper trail for the development of the kabbalistic cosmology. So, for example, you have the imagery of the Song of Songs, right? Which is very much about two human lovers, right? But its earliest interpreters imagine that text presenting an example of the kind of love that you should have for the divine, right? So you've got this sort of erotically charged human divine love relationship from the first century. Like Rabbi Akiva in the first century, like he is already saying that. Okay. And I mean, he might be second. I might have messed it up. But so he's saying that already. But also at the same time, you have people who are like, once the temple is destroyed, like they are kind of imagining a celestial prayer service occurring in this, it's occurring in celestial realms that are understood to look just like, or in part, they're understood to be partly structured on the holy temple that existed on earth, right? Mm-hmm. So you've got this, hechalot, you've got this divine palaces mysticism happening. And then sort of in all of that, you've got the Sefer Yetzirah, which introduces the term sefirot, or divine emanations, which becomes very central to Kabbalah as we understand it. And yet that text very stubbornly, almost provocatively, refuses to define those sefirot. So it says that there are 10 sefirot blima, which means either without what or with nothing, right? So it could be a question, and it could be designed to provoke you, right? So you've got those texts as a body, right? The Song of Songs, the Hechalot texts, the palaces texts, and you've got the Sefer Yetzirah. So that's on the one side. And on the other, you have the Shir Koma, which is very much an interpretation of the Song of Songs, okay? So what you see is this elaborate commentary tradition that's building on each other. And then the next major texts that are central to the development of Kabbalah, so there's the Sefer Bahir, which has 2 layers. And the first layer is very clearly a commentary on both the Sefer Yetzirah and the Shir Koma, right? Mm-hmm. So Sefer Yetzirah is the book of formation. The Shir Koma is literally the measurement of the divine body. And so you've got the first layer, which is just an out and out commentary with many things added in, because that's what commentaries do, right? That's their job. And then you've got the second layer of the Sefer Bahir, so the first layer is 10th century, the second layer is probably 12th, right? And probably for both. That's a commentary on the first layer, right? Mm-hmm. And then you have a whole proliferation of sort of early Kabbalistic texts that are commentaries on the Bahir and everything that came before it. And then you've got the Zohar, which is a compendium that its earliest materials are probably 11th century Byzantium, and the latest ones are close to the 15th century, right? And they're all commentaries on everything else that came before, right? So I guess the thing that we see is that this remythologizing is incredibly fertile, and it is a feature of a tradition that has always defined itself as cumulative and open.
Yeah, I think this cumulative point is very important to take away, because so many people, when they look at the history of Kabbalah, often they conflate various, Kabbalah is a medieval movement and they retroject it into late antiquity. But really what we have is these, Hechalot and Merkava and Shir Koma and all of this kind of stuff. And that doesn't disappear with Kabbalah. It gets kind of absorbed into it, but it is very much a negotiation with those kinds of ideas.
Absolutely.
what do you think about medicine and the role of medicine in this? So we talked about Maimonides, who was a physician.
Yeah.
How does medicine play a role in this understanding of the divine body?
I think it's really important. One of the things that's really interesting to me is that some of the earliest preserved commentaries on the Sefer Yetzirah, the Book of Formation, actually come from philosophers who are also doctors.
Mm-hmm.
Okay. So Saadia Gaon wrote a commentary on it, and Isaac Israeli wrote a commentary on it. there are at least 4 or 5 9th and 10th century commentaries on it. And and Shabbatai Donolo, he has a commentary, which we do have. And the ones that we do have are really interested in embryologies. And also the Sefer Refuot, it does not comment on the Sefer Yetzirah. So the Sefer Refuot is probably a 6th century medical textbook. It's a big compendium, and it has a lot of different materials in it, but it does have embryologies. And one of the things that becomes really important, like as a pattern in these medical texts that comment on the Sefer Yetzirah or that comment on other materials that become important to the tradition of Jewish mysticism, they have embryologies. And they devote a lot of time to those embryologies, right? So an embryology is a story of the development of the fetus. But of course, in the ancient world, like they believed that the cosmos could also be understood through, like, that it too had an embryology, right? That it was born, and it was born from something. So, and then if you go back to the Shir Koma, you see that God also God reproduces, right? And if you look at the book of Job, for example, and other books, and even Genesis 1, right? People imagine in some way that God creates the cosmos by means of divine sexual reproduction. So the book of Job has kind of a womb through which the cosmos is born. And so there are all these strands that later commentators gather to imagine, first, that God created by means of sexual reproduction, intra-divine sexual reproduction. Second, that the cosmos was created in the same way and that it propagates itself in the same way. And third, that human beings participate in that process when they reproduce. And these doctors, especially Shabbatai Donolo, and even some of the others who comment on the Sefer Yetzirah, they position human reproduction as participation in the divine process of creating and sustaining the universe. So they're super important. And I think embryology is a really important link.
Did they operate on a 1-seed or a 2-seed theory?
Almost. So that's a great question. They mostly used a 2-seed theory, but they understood it more as a 3-partner model. So the Talmud and many, I'm trying to think Sefer Refuot too. The 6th century Persian Jewish medical textbook, right? It's written in Hebrew. They understand reproduction as an occasion of intimate divine involvement with human beings. So there's a part of the Talmud that says there are 3 partners in a person: the divine, the father, and the mother. And there are even texts that stage this interaction, like the Sefer Yetzirah Havlad, which is the book of the formation of the fetus, has this incredibly elaborate narration of the encounter between God, the drop of semen, and 2 angels. And some of it actually occurs in the womb of the mother where fertilization is happening. And so God's like right up in there, right? Mm-hmm. So they really thought that there were 3 partners, not 2. So there's the man seed, the woman seed, and the divine participation, even though, and according to these models, women provided the form, like the flesh, the blood, like the muscles. The male seed provided the bones and the structure and even the intellect, but sometimes not. And God provided the spirit, the motivation, the power to speak, right? So there really were three partners. And that's why sex magic is so powerful.
So that's quite different from the Greek way of looking at things, or where, if I remember correctly, man provides form and woman provides the matter, and is kind of more of like an incubator than anything.
Yeah, well, they actually quote these sources directly. They quote Hippocrates and Galen directly, and Aristotle too, but they add something to it.
Right, because Aristotle doesn't have these three.
But he has the cheese.
Right.
And you can see in the Talmud there, and even in Sefer Refuot, there's a cheese theory. And actually the Sefer Refuot is pretty mad at Aristotle because they don't like his ideas about spontaneous generation and parthenogenesis, because later, parthenogenesis was kind of the Jewish understanding of the Christian Immaculate Conception. They're like, this is nonsense. Nobody can do that. They're just lying. Like, parthenogenesis isn't real. And we're really invested in saying it's not real. Yeah.
I did want to actually, maybe I'll skip ahead in my questions now that we're on this topic. So there's many who theorize that the emphatically feminine Shekinah, or divine presence, is a Jewish response to the development of the Christian cult of Mary in the Middle Ages. The problem with this is that Mary is the archetypal virgin, obviously, and it's a kind of desexualized passive receptacle for God's creative power. And the Shekinah, on the other hand, is an aspect of God, and that aspect through which sexual processes internal to God operate. So what do we make of this comparison with the Virgin Mary, and what do we make of the differences?
Yeah, that's a good question. I mean, I think if a person were to go ahead and assert that Mary has nothing to do with this, they would then be asserting that people who lived in people who practiced different religions lived in radical isolation from each other and never spoke and never heard anything from each other. That is simply untrue. We know that's not true, right? So I think probably in both cases, I think people are responding in some ways to bureaucracy, because bureaucracy tends to be a masculinized institutional life, and they tend to get in between the practitioner and their experience of the divine. They try to regulate that, or they try to prescribe exactly how that should happen, and they decide what is valid and what isn't, what can be incorporated into the ideology of the institution, and what and what is a threat to it, right? So on the one hand, you have the increasing institutionalization of the church, right? And especially with the Fourth Lateran Council in 1215. But on the Jewish side, I think in some ways it's a response to the increasing power of rationalism. And they too kind of get in between the individual and their experience of the divine, saying, oh, guess what? God isn't like you. Like, you have a body, but God doesn't. You die, but God doesn't. You change, but God doesn't. And if you're going to go ahead and imagine God having a form or a body or even feelings like we have feelings, then what you're doing is you are essentially insulting God, right? And that's blasphemy, right? Although blasphemy is not really a Jewish term. Okay. So I think it is a disembodiment of the divine and an attempt to kind of emphasize the transcendent aspects of the divine. And I think the kind of emergent, like the coalescence of the generation and the coalescence of myths regarding the female, and especially around the process of pregnancy and birth, is a way to counteract that, or to add to it, or to engage in dialogue with it. So I think they're experiencing similar things, but differently. I think they're definitely talking to each other. And I think the generation of myths about a divine feminine, they're not an accident. Right. So that's sort of a long answer that says, I can't say exactly how, but yeah, for sure. They're connected.
Yeah. People are riffing off each other, even if they don't want to necessarily admit it, or at least reacting or responding.
I think they're sharing an experience, and they're experiencing a contradiction, and they're generating myths in response to similar contradictions. And they're definitely hearing each other's stories. Just as you say, they're riffing.
Yes. So maybe we could go back. I want to talk about the Song of Songs and its role in both Jewish mysticism and in sex magic. So this is a text that plays prominently in my own research, thanks to the theme of the Binsica, or the mors osculi, the kiss of death. In the Renaissance, men like Pico della Mirandola identified, based on their own readings of rabbinical commentaries, that this kiss was a mingling of breaths between God and his prophets, like a mingling of disembodied spirits. And as such, it was ultimately responsible for leading them out of their bodies into a second death, so to speak, where their souls become one with the Creator. It's for this reason that Psalm 116 states, precious in the sight of the Lord is the death of his saints, because when his saints die, they return to be one with Hashem. And this was as much the end goal of the sage for many medieval and Renaissance Christian mystics. So could you expand on the use of the Song of Songs from within a Jewish context, wherein presumably interpreters were less hung up on allegorical readings, or at least the same kinds of allegorical readings that Christians were doing, wherein the relationship depicted was interpreted as that belonging to Christ and his church. As I understand it, the typical allegorical interpretation among Jews was the two characters in the poem represent Hashem and his love for Israel. But if I'm not mistaken, Jews didn't shy away from the literal interpretation in the same way Christians did, due to their strong Platonic emphasis on immaterial or incorporeal and arguably sex negative characteristics of their interpretation.
Okay. I like that question a lot. Well, I mean, I think the whole thing centers on allegory. Okay. So Jews don't really do allegory because, I mean, so the whole Pardes model, right? Pshat, the simple meaning; remez, the hinted meaning; drash, the moral or extended or even cosmological meaning; and so the secret meaning, which would be like what it tells you about the divine nature and the human relationship to the divine. Those are understood to build on each other. And if you're going to imagine it as a ladder to a loft, Jews never kick out the ladder. They never kick out that literal meaning. Everything is based in that literal meaning. Unlike
Plato's Symposium, which is where the ladder comes from.
Exactly. You got it. You don't kick out the ladder, right? But if it's a true allegory, you do kick out the ladder, because the particulars, the material particulars of the allegory are not important. Their only goal is to point to that higher allegorical meaning. And after that, you can dispense with them. In the Jewish tradition, you don't.
Yeah, that's something that I see a lot in the Christian interpretation of this kind of material, is that the spiritual, like the spiritual level, I suppose the sod, or the secret interpretation, is the highest, and it doesn't invalidate the other ones, but definitely there's a privileging of this immaterial spiritual reading. And I feel like in Judaism, it's, as you say, there is more of a cumulative building and less of a privileging of the most secret at the expense of the literal.
Right. So I think, people do preserve the literal. They do have some compunctions about it, right? Like Rabbi Akiva, who is my favorite early interpreter of the Song of Songs, says, he warns people against warbling the Song of Songs in taverns.
Huh.
And he says, he compares the Song of Songs to the Holy of Holies. And so the Song of Songs, so the Holy of Holies is the inner sanctum of the holy temple where the human being can encounter the divine. And he says the whole world was not worth the day on which the Song of Songs was created. So the idea then is that this encounter, this human encounter, this sexual encounter, is a space where human beings are also having the most sacred contact with the divine, right? And sacred, like kadosh, literally means set apart, right? So that's kind of back to his warning not to warble the Song of Songs in taverns. It's not because it's too sexy, it's because it's the wrong setting, right? Because this is the Holy of Holies and you shouldn't be singing it while you're drunk. This is an early interpretive tradition and it really holds, right? So, and one of the things that we see is that, say in the Shir Koma, which was most likely 5th to 7th century, it is an elaborate commentary on the Song of Songs. So one of the things the Song of Songs does is it has these long descriptions of, the male beloved's body and the female lover's body, right? And it describes them part by part. And the Shir Koma is literally the measurement of the body. And so it takes up some of the same sequences from the Song of Songs. And the Song of Songs says, it tells you what materials each part of the body is made out of or compared to. So you've got loins that are made, you've got ivory and you've got lapis lazuli and you've got gold and you've got all these different materials. And the Shir Koma has the divine body parts made out of the same materials as they are in the Song of Songs. Oh. And it also, it's really something. And it also echoes some of the language. So the line from the Song of Songs, I am my beloved and my beloved is, I am my beloved's and my beloved is mine. It echoes that same line after a similar anatomical description, but it says, I am my people Israel's and my people Israel is mine, right? And so it just transposes that from a love song between two people to a love song between God and the people of Israel, right?
Right.
So in some ways, that's consonant with the Jesus and the Jesus and the church. Mm-hmm. But what's interesting is that in the Song of, in the Shir Koma, it actually has this phrase on an amulet that is worn on God's right arm. So God's actually wearing the people Israel, and that kind of inscription of his love for them and their love for him, he's wearing it like a magic, like an amulet.
Yeah, God is a talismanic magician.
Yeah, but the talisman is right there and it's on God's body and people are participating in it because they're on God's body. And so, the whole thing is an incredibly elaborate commentary on the Song of Songs. And of course, it brings in a lot of hechalot or like palaces or Merkava, divine chariot material. It's understood to be a part of that corpus, but it's a very attentive, mythological commentary on the Song of Songs.
Right. Now, did the death of the kiss figure at all in Jewish interpretation? Did that ever become a thing where people obsessed over this kind of annihilation in God? Yeah.
Yeah. But they didn't, I think it's a warning. So there's the parable of the four who entered the divine orchard. Mm-hmm. And one of those four goes to join God. It's only Rabbi Akiva who goes up and comes down in peace. One dies, one cuts the shoots. What happens to the other one?
He stays out.
Yeah, he stays out. Okay. Yeah. So it's more like a warning.
Right.
It's not like, oh, come and do this. This is not a good idea.
Right. So Rabbi Akiva is our Amitabha Buddha who gets enlightened and then comes back to Earth until everybody gets enlightened. It's not a field book to tell you to go and annihilate yourself into
Absolutely
the divine.
not. He's the model.
Right.
And he's also the model for preparation, right? Because Acher, he cuts down the shoots, right? He goes crazy.
Is that a sexual metaphor? Because I've seen that in other places as referring to either sodomy or wasting seed, that is cutting the shoots.
That is not how I understood it.
Okay.
Although there's this narrative episode where, I guess it's called a story. There's a story where he comes back and he solicits a prostitute, and the prostitute says, "What's wrong with you?" He doesn't answer, and she says, "Oh, he's not the same person. He's changed." Right? Because, you would never do this. But what people generally interpret that to mean is that he spoke heresy and corrupted his students.
Okay.
The students are the shoots, and speaking heresy, teaching them heresy, he's cutting them down. And the heresy, what people understood that to be, is that there are two powers in the heavens. Because they say that some people say that he saw Metatron, right? Mm-hmm. Who looks almost as good as God. And Metatron features heavily in the Shir Koma as well.
So Metatron, because Metatron is one of these intensely debated figures when you get into dealing with the active intellect of the Arab philosophers. And some people are saying, the active intellect is Metatron, but some postulated that active intellect is God, and so you can become one with God and annihilate yourself in the active intellect. And that is becoming the Metatron. But there are lots and lots and lots of different ideas about this. Could you talk about it in its origin, or perhaps I don't know how far back we can go for the Metatron, but
we can go to the Hebrew Bible.
Yeah. Okay. And it's not a Greek word, right?
Oh, it is. It is. Okay. Because it's Enoch, right?
Yes.
So there's this idea that Enoch walked with God, and so there's that part, like that story doesn't explain, like it doesn't depict him dying. It just it depicts him being alive and then walking with God, right? And so there's a lot of midrashic writing on that to explain just how that happened. And I have to say, I'm not really familiar with that. So just so you know, I do not really know. But I know that in the Shir Koma, he's there, he's looking almost as good as God. And he sits at his side. And there's a point in the celestial prayer service where God is actually holding Metatron, right? He's holding him. He says he grabs hold of him. Probably it could be his face, like his panim, his countenance, and he holds him in his radiance. So like, this is very intimate, right? God is grabbing his face and holding him in his radiance.
Is this sexual, or is this surrender? Because Greeks would always grab the beard of their opponent when they were surrendering. They would get on one knee and grab the beard. You see this in a lot of pottery, and I'm wondering if that is a transferable tradition.
Well, it's possible, but I don't see it that way, because it's like almost like the culmination of it, like it's part of the prayer service. And so what he's doing is he's taking he grabs his panim, like his cheek. So if it were beard, it would probably be something else.
Does he have a beard in the Shir Kama? Is it measured?
Oh, yeah. God does. Absolutely. Yeah. And it's measured. Yeah.
Everything's measured in parasangs, which is this Persian unit of measurement that nobody uses anymore. But I guess that's what we measured the royal highway in the Persian Empire with. Yeah. And it gets carried over to these measurements of God's body. I heard there are people who have done these 3D models of the measurements. And when you look at the image that is produced by the descriptions, it's like God has a huge head and like long arms and long fingers and a small little torso, and how did they
penis.
Yeah, how did they come up with that? And the hands too, like that makes sense. It's all based on taking the Song of Songs and mapping that out?
There are no measurements in the Song of Songs,
right,
as far as I know. And I've taught it a lot of times, so I'm assuming I'm right. I don't know how they get the measurements, but I know they're very specific about the dimensions of the face and of the penis, because they say it matches a man, right? They say that there's it's a ratio of the forehead to the length of the face and of the tip of the pinky finger to the palm of the hand, right? So they say that that's just in human beings. Those two are so the pinky finger to palm of the hand is the penis measurement, and then the proportions of the face they say they're identical as in human beings. So those are the parts that are sort of important. And one of the things that's really important about the way the description goes, both in the Song of Songs and in the Shir Koma, is that it goes from the loins down and the loins up, but it centers on the loins.
So are there practical applications for the Shir Koma? Like, we talk about sex magic, and magic is usually thought of as a kind of practical endeavor, whereas mysticism is more of a contemplative endeavor. So what are the practical aspects of Shir Koma?
So the Zohar actually includes specific instructions for what you're supposed to do. And essentially it's a missionary position: thighs touching thighs, arms touching arms, face touching face, right? Mm-hmm. And it says, through this, blessings descend upon the world, and many of the righteous are brought into the world. So it's not just about an individual conception. It's about, first of all, bringing the divine energy down, which is maybe understood in terms of semen, mm-hmm. and also getting lots of other people pregnant with good babies. Mm-hmm. So strangely, you don't just get yourself pregnant, you bring souls down into the world. So that's one application. And then Moshe Cordovero in the 16th century in Sfat, he wrote a whole description of the ritual. And he literally says that when you're supposed to meditate, you're supposed to repent of your sins. There are all kinds of things that you're supposed to do to prepare. But he says that when you're doing it, like when you're actually having sex, and it says when they are one, and his member is partly within him and partly within her, they make a shiur koma. So they are actually emulating the divine coitus that occurs as described in the shiur koma. And then again, the purpose is the same, except, Moshe Cordovero was very interested in redemption, right? Redemption of all of Israel and bringing the Messiah. And so he believed that this could help bring the Messiah. So for him, there's a messianic component that is present, but absolutely less obvious in the Zohar.
Right. Because he's got to come.
There's a practical effect. It's messianism.
Right. And presumably it's tied in with a lot of ritual purity that is laid out in the Torah, only on Shabbos and that sort of thing.
For Cordovero, it's supposed to be at midnight on Shabbat, and you're supposed to wash your hands, and you're supposed to meditate on the unification of the divine, and you're supposed to repent of your sins. But after all that, you are to gladden your wife with speech related to the precept of reproduction, of being fruitful and multiplying. So it's not all ritual and repentance. Before you start the sex magic, you're supposed to have a little sexy talk.
Not just chava.
No, you're right, exactly.
So maybe we could move on to the Bahir more specifically. Is this the first work where God is explicitly depicted as having two genders?
Absolutely not.
No. Okay.
Absolutely not. I mean, you could go back to Genesis for that.
Okay.
Because it says, 1:26 through 28, male and female, he created them in his image.
Right. Is this Adam Kadmon? And is Adam Kadmon bigendered?
Adam Kadmon is definitely bigendered, and Adam Kadmon does appear in the Bahir.
Mm-hmm.
God is not called Adam Kadmon in Genesis, but so I think what?
It's the Tselem, the image.
But Tselem is image, yeah.
Yeah.
So there are all kinds of midrashim that talk about this human creation in the divine image, and whether it's the bodies that are in the divine image, male and female. So does that mean that God is male and female? So there's speculation on that. But even in the Shir Koma, God is bigendered and having sex with God's self. There's this was the passage that really clued me in. So it's a description of God on the divine chariot. And again, the divine chariot is imagery that comes from the Song of Songs. And it says she sat me in the most lavish of chariots, which means, sex, right?
Mm-hmm.
And so here we have God seated in the divine chariot. Okay, fine. There's all this imagery of God seated on a chariot. That's nothing really remarkable. But then it says there's a reference in the text to God's body, right? And God's body can mean God's body straight up, but it's also a euphemism for penis, right?
Mm-hmm.
And it says that there's a rainbow over God's body.
Oh, the glory?
It's a keshet, so it means bow.
So it's not
right?
the kabod.
No, it's a keshet, right? And then a little bit later, it's going back to the keshet, and it says that the keshet has folds. So there's a keshet sitting on God's body, and it has folds in it. It's like, oh, this is no ordinary rainbow. and in the ancient, like in these Merkavah texts, there's this idea that God is the whole celestial realms. It's not like, oh, there's God, and then there's the realm around God, and then there are just all these different layers of the celestial realm. They're actually all understood to be part of God. So
it's panentheistic?
The celestial realm is God.
Okay. But not the material realm.
Yeah, it's not the material realm.
Okay.
But here you have God seated in the chariot, which has a really specific meaning in the Song of Songs. And then you've got a rainbow over his body that has folds. I was like, okay, this is a bigendered deity, and this text depicts this bigendered deity having sex with God's self. So it has a long, long history, right? This idea of intra-divine sexuality.
Right. But it hadn't been mixed up with the Sefirot tradition, right? That's something that comes later.
No. And it sort of comes later and sort of doesn't, because the Sefer Yetzirah does talk about 10 Sefirot, and it's contemporaneous with the Shir Koma. And in many ways, those two are companion pieces, with sort of the Shir Koma talking about God's body and situating it within the celestial realms, where the Sefer Yetzirah is talking about the carving out of letters from the divine body that are then used to create the whole universe. Mm-hmm. So you've got this kind of bigendered divine body that's described at length in the Shir Koma. And then you've got what's taken out of that body with the 10 Sefirot, used with the 10 Sefirot to create the whole universe. So what really makes Kabbalah is the interpretive traditions that map what's in the Shir Koma onto the Sefer Yetzirah, or the other way around, plus a lot of other things added in.
Right. It's like a best of compilation.
Yeah. And so like the building blocks for the Sephirotic cosmos, right, and for the Sephirotic divinity, they're there. And so it's a question of how you construct a narrative out of them. And so you were talking about the Bahir, and I actually forgot your question about the Bahir.
Well, just was it the first instance where God was a bi-gendered thing, and then after that, was it the first where it became wrapped up with the Sefirot?
So what's kind of interesting about it is that it doesn't call the different aspects of the divine Sefirot. It calls them all kinds of other things, but not Sefirot. And there aren't necessarily 10, sometimes there are 13, and sometimes there are 10, right?
Right. It's not the Zohar where there's only 10.
Yeah. But the second layer of the Bahir does really describe divine aspects that get mapped onto the 10 Sefirot almost reliably. So the Bahir is the place where these 10 aspects get elaborated along with a lot of other things. So they're not systematized, right? But as time goes on, these things do get systematized. And that's when you get the cosmology of the Zohar, like the Sephirotic cosmology.
Mm-hmm.
I don't know if that helps.
Oh, it does, definitely. And then from, why is the Zohar so different, I guess? Or is it different? It seems to me like it comes from a kind of different approach than the Bahir and of course it is in a way a commentary on the Sefer Yetzirah, if I'm not mistaken.
Absolutely. And the Shir Kama and the Song of Songs and the whole Bible. And so when I say it doesn't get systemized until the Zohar, it's kind of a lie. Just because the Zohar isn't, like, it has so many systems. Like,
right.
So Dan Abrams talks about this in his book, and he's like, what's the difference between, let me try to dig it out of my fuzzy brain. But he talks about how there are kind of images and symbols, right?
Mm-hmm.
An image is, an image can have functions that are not circumscribed, right? It can mean a lot of different things. But when the meanings of those images become systematized, they become symbols.
Right. So like an abstract painting has no meaning, but the letter Aleph, let's say, has some meaning.
Yes, except that Aleph can have lots of meanings until it's placed in relationship to a bunch of other images, right? And then they become a system, right? And so then together they have, it's not just one symbol, but it's like a system of symbols. And so what he's saying about the Bahir is that there are lots of images, but their meanings are not systematized. And I think you could say the same thing about the Zohar, except they are systematized within particular narrative ecologies, right? Because let's not forget that the earliest sections of the Zohar come from probably about the 11th century Byzantium. And the first layer of the Bahir here probably comes from the 10th century Byzantium. So parts of those texts are contemporaneous or nearly contemporaneous with each other. And the later you go in the layers of the Zohar, then the more these systems of symbols seem to emerge. But if you want the different parts of the Zohar to agree with each other, then you have a big problem.
Because they're written by different people at different times,
and also their thought experiments. I think that's the point.
Right.
Like, it's not, again, it's like the narrative mode of thinking as opposed to the
it's discursive
mode of thinking, philosophical mode of thinking.
Yeah.
The Zohar is not propositional, it's narrative.
Right.
Yeah.
So how do we get from all of this medieval kind of stuff to the stuff we find in New Age bookstores today? And who calls the shots to say it's not true Kabbalah? What is Kabbalah and what is New Age reimagination? Is Kabbalah not a living tradition? Why does it become a new thing in the present day?
That's a great question. I mean, So you want to know how it gets from there to here?
Well, I mean, we don't even have to, because I know your book, it focuses on the medieval element and then does a comparison with the New Age material, if I'm not mistaken, rather than a kind of genealogy through the early modern period of how we get to the New Age. I was wondering if you just had some ideas on that.
Well, I guess what I want to know is how they use the traditions that are available to them,
mm-hmm.
and what's retained and what's changed and why. And so what I recognized when I spoke to people is that there is sort of a common ritual grammar. And that ritual grammar, so it's like a structure, but in terms of the content, it's possible to draw on what's available, and nobody sees a good reason not to. And so I think Kabbalah supplies some of the ritual grammar that structures the contemporary practice of certain kinds of sex magic, right? Mm-hmm. Like the kind that I'm describing as opposed to all the others. And that they arrive at that position simply through, the traditions of Western esotericism and how they allowed people to imagine what would become New Age religion.
Right. So presumably Crowley and the Golden Dawn and all these people who are drawing on, almost Christian interpretations of the Kabbalah, and then bringing that into their magical practices. And then that becomes popularized during, I assume, the 1960s and 70s into what we call the New Age today. And so is that a real important figure in the New Age kabbalistic sex magic? Is it all roads lead back to Crowley, or were there?
I don't think so. I think the Theosophical Society was important. Yes. I think there in Blavatsky, I think there are just so many players. And the fact is, I'm not really an expert on what happened in the 19th and early 20th centuries. But I know too, the Kabbalah Center, the movements that kind of produced the Kabbalah Center were already underway in the 40s and 50s, and perhaps even earlier, because there have always been movements to popularize Kabbalah. And one of the major conflicts in the development of the Kabbalah Center was whether to make this available only to Jews or to anybody who wanted it. Right. And so I think they too are part of the 20th century and 21st century popularization of Kabbalah.
Right. And are this cautiousness, is this all just going back to the catastrophes of Shabbatai Tzvi and those kinds of figures, or?
The cautiousness is built into the tradition of Kabbalah. Mm-hmm. Right. So there's this idea that you're only supposed to do it after you're 40 and you have 2 children, a boy and a girl, and you've studied the Torah and you know what's in it. Why? Because it's a cumulative tradition. That's why. Right. And it's meant to add extra layers of meaning to the Torah. So for them, the question is, will it even matter to them if they haven't studied the Torah? Just like in early Christianity, people were like, well, will it even matter to people if they're not Jewish? Because this is obviously building on a Jewish tradition. And we know the way Christianity went. And it's also the way the Kabbalah Center went. Yeah.
I know of, a lot of people who use Kabbalah in a New Age context today. And often it's like what you say, it's a grammar that they have. They have the words, but it's like the meanings lurking beneath the words are derooted, and they're taken out of their original context, usually a biblical context. And in that way, they get reinterpreted in all kinds of wacky and weird ways, basically to say whatever it is that the person wants to say. How much of that is in Jewish Kabbalah? Was there reimaginings and reinterpretations, or maybe traditional dead ends where people had to make up and supply their own stuff? Is that something that happens a lot in different sects of Judaism?
It happens in all religions all the time.
Yeah.
And in terms of thinking about that process, right? So linguistics, the study of linguistics is quite helpful in that. So you've got Saussure's understanding of how, like, just what language is and how it works. And again, this is I'm probably committing several travesties at once when I say this. When you study linguistics, you study syntax, right? Which is, the way sentences are put together and the way meaning is structured, right? You study semantics, which is the meaning of the individual words, right? And then you study reception, because you could have a universally agreed upon syntax, and you could have words that most people attribute a range of meanings to, but it's the cultural and social setting that is it's where the rubber meets the road, right? Like, that's where the word gets used. And so all religions do this, and we do this when we speak, right? So when I'm talking about ritual grammar, I'm talking about the syntax that people have kind of extracted without even knowing it from their exposure to different religious traditions. And it turns out that the syntax can agree, right, between traditions. Then you talk about the words that you put in, which come from narrative and ritual traditions, right? And then you have the cultural context where they supply the meaning that resonates with them. And of course, New Age religions are very heavy on that third aspect of the creation of meaning, right?
Yeah.
So it is the process by which religions stay alive. And in terms of Kabbalah, you see people like Bahya ibn Bakuda constructing, who was 11th century Iberian and writing in Judeo-Arabic, like constructing rituals and meditations from his Sufi neighbors who he really admired. And you see, I think the Bahir drawing on concepts from late antiquity, like some heterodox, both Christian and Jewish concepts that somehow didn't get integrated into the canon, but are very powerful in the Bahir. And so I would never want to say that a religion exists in isolation and only recycles its own building materials. It doesn't, it can't, and it shouldn't either.
Yeah, you can never step in the same river twice.
Yeah, there's that. And also, you live in the world. Like, no matter where you are, you live in the world, and you live with people who are different from you, and you have meaningful interactions with them, and you think together, and you imagine together, and you should. So Kabbalah is made in the same way. Right.
I had a question. How does Abraham Abulafia figure into all of this stuff? Because, his Kabbalah was very different from a lot of the stuff going around in the Middle Ages. And I was wondering, does he have a kind of sexual dimension to his more, I suppose, letrist or prophetic, ecstatic Kabbalah?
Okay, I'm not an expert in Abulafia, but I know that a lot of his work interprets the Sefer Yetzirah, and it does so using Sufi methodologies and also Maimonidean philosophy.
Yes.
And so he is rather disembodied. Like, for him, if you're getting a prophecy, you're almost, it's imaginal. It's very deliberately and self-consciously imaginal.
Yeah.
So I don't know how he figures into this. I just know he's probably, like, he's with Bahya and that he draws on Sufi rituals, and he's with Maimonides and that he kind of doesn't want to imagine an embodied experience.
Yeah.
I wrote about him in my last book, but I was really interested in his diagrams of the letter combination rituals from the Sefer Yetzirah. So that's my connection with him.
It's interesting that we use the term now ecstatic Kabbalah to describe what Abulafia was doing, because ecstasy, in the original Greek etymological sense, means standing outside of the body.
Right, so which is what he does.
Yeah, so it's like all about leaving the body, but then also you have, sexual ecstasy, which is the other kind of locus that humans encounter ecstasy, and that it is an entirely embodied ecstasy. Or maybe, I don't know, some people would claim to leave the body or to experience a kind of boundary dissolution during sex.
Right.
So it's like leaving your body in the body versus leaving your body out of the body kind of tension.
Yeah. And well, in the Kabbalistic text, in a way, it's a kind of shamanism, because if you do it, you can climb the sporadic tree, and you can inhabit Shekhinah, and you can inhabit Tiferet, and you can bring him down to her, and then you can bring the blessings down. It's a journey. Yeah. It's sort of an in the body, out of the body journey.
Right. So maybe I can ask you, before wrapping things up, about historiography, a more recent historiography. Do you think that there's still a privileging of the incorporeal over the corporeal in the study of Kabbalah? I
think that's going away.
Yeah?
I think, I mean...
In spite of Gershom Scholem and all of these...
And Edel. Even Edel used to be the one who was saying, okay, there's ecstatic Kabbalah, and there's practical Kabbalah, and he's the one who's creating. He's really emphasizing the divisions in the fields, and now he's moving away from that.
Oh no, I didn't know that. I mean, I read all of his stuff, but he writes so much that it's hard to keep up with him. He
has this really lovely book. I think it was 2018. Is the Privileged Feminine Divine in Kabbalah, and there he really does talk about embodiment. I mean, he's an amazing scholar, and he's growing and changing all the time. And he's truly appreciative of what, of those who came before him and of the scholarship that comes after him. I'm just really impressed with him as a human being.
Yeah, he's a huge inspiration for me in terms of just the breadth and depth of his knowledge, and especially because he can, he's got such an in-depth knowledge of the Jewish material, but then he also has this crazy in-depth knowledge of the Renaissance and Renaissance philosophy, and how all of this stuff gets absorbed and incorporated and debated with Christian circles. And I think that that's something that I don't see as much in a lot of other authors who are narrower in their focus, and for good reason. But he really helps to frame the big picture. I think my favorite book by him was Kabbalah in Italy, and I think that's just what it's called, and that is a great book, and that's the book that really does a lot of this parsing of different. You've got your Spanish Kabbalah, and then you've got your Abulafian ecstatic Kabbalah, and then you've got the Hasidic material, and then you've got everything that's going on in the East, and it's all cross-pollinating in a way. And as you say, there's these cumulative elements of it. And I think that's, scholars
he's
like
amazing
him.
At the big picture view, and at kind of making you a map of it, right? It's really amazing.
And also tying in the Arabic material. He goes on into Ibn Washia and the Picatrix, and talks about the connections of all these things that certain Kabbalists had, like Yohanan Alamano. And that's super fascinating to me, how people marry, let's say, planetary astral magic with Kabbalah. You see different people doing it, and I can't tell you how many different correspondences I've seen in different texts with the planets to spherote one-to-one thing. They're all different, right? Some are like, only the bottom really 7 are the planets, and then some say all 10 are the parts of the heavens, and just lots of debates there. But it's interesting to see how it's a living tradition. But so do you think it's changing? There is less of a privileging of the incorporeal over the corporeal in current scholarship.
I do. And I think it has more to do with us as a culture, right? I think in the ancient world and in the medieval world, people really did see the body as a map of the cosmos, right? And that you could learn from studying the body. You could learn about the cosmos. You could learn about the divine. And I think, strangely enough, and this is not the only component, but our culture also sees the body as a map, right? And partly because of the research into DNA, and partly because the medical industry is one of the biggest industries, and it powers our economy by mapping the body and interacting with it and finding out its secrets, right? And then also in terms of the body as a symbol for what's inside, right? Or for what your views are, or like we have, our bodies in some ways are more malleable than they used to be. And we have more options in terms of presentation. And so I think this almost like this capitalist view of the body somehow maps onto the ancient view of the body, insofar as it is the key to understanding the cosmos, however you imagine it.
It is the irreducible unit.
An irreducible unit? What do you mean?
Well, it's like the lowest common denominator is the individual human bodies. We live in tribes, we live in families, we live in nations, but ultimately all of those things are comprised of human bodies. And below that, there's no, there's just death if you try to divide more than that.
And that human body is deeply invested with significance. And that body is meant to represent the whole. And so I think that's a parallel that we have with the ancient and medieval worlds. Even though the cosmos that it maps is very different. But the body is not just the lowest common denominator, it is the richest unit of meaning, right? Like Bachia says that too. Mm-hmm. He's like, if you want to study the creator, study the human body.
Yeah.
If you want to study the cosmos, study the human body. I think we think the same thing now.
Yeah, it's the most complex organism known in the universe.
Exactly. So it's both the lowest common denominator and the most complex.
Yeah. So you can totally see how it is, made in the image of God as this very immanent, but also entirely transcendent thing. Or
in the image of the economy.
Could you go into that?
Yeah. I mean, I just think that just as we said, like our culture is very much structured by, we're a capitalist culture with a capitalist economy. You make money by using your body, right? Mm-hmm. Capitalism is extracting surplus value from labor, right? Mm-hmm. And other things too. And many of our industries center on the human body. Our biggest industries do. So the body is a map of the economy, which is itself a cosmology. It's a social cultural cosmology. And so the common link is that the body is the map of the whole.
Right.
The whole system.
Can we even speak of embodiment from within a materialist conception? Because it's like,
I don't know what you mean.
So like if you're a kind of staunch modern materialist who doesn't believe in the spirit or God or anything like that, can we even speak of embodiment? Because it seems like embodiment is something like about an awareness of the body, perhaps, but what is the locus from which the observer is watching, right? Like, because they are a body, depending on their worldview, of course.
Some people talk about embodiment as the experience of the body, right? Mm-hmm. So it's your experience of your own body, like, and how it functions in the world.
Right. But is it not like a tooth trying to bite itself? Like
that's great. Maybe it is.
Because that's how I kind of think of it. It's like all this talk of embodiment only really works from within a paradigm that allows for spirit or
mind-body
soul
separation.
Yes, exactly. And it seems like if you collapse that dichotomy, it's very difficult to talk about embodiment because it's the body feeling the body. And so there is no... Sorry, go on.
No, then you're with Kristeva, right? And then you're with the oceanic feeling. And maybe that's what it's all about, right? Is like this sort of movement back and forth between unity and between like union and separation.
Multiplicity, yeah.
So maybe embodiment kind of falls in that gap.
Right.
Like,
very interesting.
So the idea is that religion is like many mystical practices are aimed at breaking down the cognition like the cognitive habits that lead us to understand ourselves as separated.
Yeah, the boundaries, right? Is dissolving them.
Yeah, dissolving boundaries and also breaking cognitive habits that make them.
Right.
Okay. And so you only talk about embodiment when you're not in that state of dissolution, but nobody can live in the state of dissolution.
Right. Unless you're Rabbi Akiva.
Yeah. Well, he came back and then lived his regular life, you know?
Right. Right.
That state is temporary. And so I guess ideally the state, I don't know. Embodiment is a product of the soul body separation and the mind body separation. And yet we live with that. I think that is a condition of society. I think that's where I'm going with that.
All right.
Yeah.
So before we wrap up, do you have anything that you wanted to discuss or add to our discussion?
I just want to say thanks. This was really fun and interesting, and you made me think pretty hard, and I believe that I learned some things.
Oh, wow.
And I wish I'd heard more about your research, honestly.
Well, we can always get together and talk about it again. But thank you. I appreciate that. And I really love this discussion. And, you know, there's so much more we could talk about, but I think that this, without overwhelming too many people too quickly, this is a good introduction to your book. And I would highly recommend everybody run out and grab a copy. If you have My Picatrix, you know, it'll sit right next to it and look great. They match in their jackets. So when does that come out? Is it already out?
It came out September 8th.
Okay. So, and that is available. You can get it on the PSU Press website. You can get it on Amazon or whatever. Presumably, those are the two main places to get it?
Yes.
All right. And will you be doing any kind of talking, or I suppose with the pandemic, it's difficult, but...
I have a talk coming up through Cornell University, November 3rd, and I'm going to visit in person the University of Waterloo.
Oh, wow.
March 17th, I think.
Well, I will be there for sure then.
Yay, I'll get to see you.
Yes.
Okay. So yeah, there's all kinds of stuff coming up. And also I did a talk with the Aquarian Minion, which is still available online if you want to have a look at it. All
right. Okay. Dr. Marla Segol, thank you very much for coming on the show. And I appreciate your time. And I hope that everybody enjoys this discussion as much as I did.
And thank you so much for having me.